Here is a photo of Jerusalem. And some of you, I'm sure, in this room have been to Jerusalem, and you've probably looked at Jerusalem from that particular angle, probably from up on the Mount of Olives. And you can probably remember your first time of looking in that city, if you have been there. And for me, I have been there, have been lucky enough to go there. And I do remember distinctly the first time I looked at that city in that way. And it's just an amazing city. And it's just got this feel about that city when you look at it. Not only the history of the place, which is obviously amazing and immense, and you think about all those things, but there's like this destiny feel about the place. It's like a very, very special city, and the feeling which I've got at no other place I've been to in the world. And that's obviously true for Christadelphians and Christian people who have got that affinity with that city. But it's true of other people as well. Like I worked with a girl who went to Jerusalem, and she had no religious background whatsoever. And I was talking to her about her trip to Jerusalem, and she said the same thing. She said when she was in that city, there was a feeling about the place. There was a destiny about the place. There was something special that she felt about that city. Because it's the city, isn't it? It's God's city. It's God's place. And it's going to play the most important role in the purpose of God out of any other city. And of course we know from what Jesus said that that city, particularly over the last 2,000 years, has gone through a tumultuous history. Jesus said in the prophecy on the Sermon on the Mount, not the prophecy on the Sermon on the Mount, the Olivet prophecy. He said towards the end of that about what would happen to Jerusalem. And he said, "They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem is going to be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles." And that happened, didn't it, in AD 70. The Jews were ripped out of that city, and that city, Jerusalem, has been trampled down for the last 2,000 years by so many different people. It was taken into the hands of the Romans in AD 70. And the Romans had it for a couple of hundred years. And then Constantine, as the leader of the Holy Roman, not the Holy Roman Empire, but the Byzantine Empire, he took over Jerusalem. And he got his grubby hands all over Jerusalem, and he built these filthy churches and filthy holy sites over every single one of the important sites in Jerusalem. But he didn't last long either, because then Muhammad came to Jerusalem, and he apparently went up from the Temple Mount and ascended into heaven. And it became one of the most holy sites for the Muslim people, a site which they revere second only to Mecca in the world. And then the Muslims moved in for hundreds of years. And then the call came from the Catholic Church for the European people from Europe to go down into Jerusalem to recapture that place as a holy city. And so the Crusaders went down and they kicked out the Muslims. And those wars raged for decades. And then eventually the Crusaders were kicked out by Saladin, who was a great leader of the time. But Saladin eventually too was kicked out. And then the Ottomans moved in. And they trampled down in Jerusalem, and they possessed it for hundreds of years also, until we looked a couple of nights ago that eventually the purpose of God was that the British should come in at the end of World War I. And they took Jerusalem back. And not Robert Allenby, I was going to say, who was a golfer, but General Allenby walked into the city of Jerusalem, and he reclaimed Jerusalem from the Ottoman people. And then eventually, we're going to see tonight that finally, that city was going to return. And that's what Jesus said would happen. He continued on his words. He said, it's going to be trampled down for all these hundreds of years, but there will come a day, there will come a time when the Jewish people will return to the city again. And 2,000 years have gone past. That's amazing. And that time was going to come when the Jewish people were going to return to that land and to that city again. And the events of the Six-Day War in 1967 was that time. Was that moment in history that Jesus talked about when the Jewish people would reclaim Jerusalem back and it would be back in Jewish hands. And that's what we want to have a look at tonight, a little bit about the events that surround that particular time. Now, 1967, what was going on in 1967? Some of you may be able to remember. I was not alive for another 11 years. But the Vietnam War was raging. The USSR was strong in the world, and so was the US, and the Cold War was right in the middle of these two superpowers. Muhammad Ali was at the peak of his powers, right? Absolute peak of his powers. The Richmond Tigers won the AFL Grand Final, interestingly. And the Beatles, just 4 days before the Six-Day War, released their album, the Sgt. Pepper's album, which was their most successful album. So it was the raging the end of the 60s, and the world itself was going through a period of change and a period of turmoil. And right in the middle of all that, there was these events that happened in the Middle East. And of course, I can remember in my lifetime that there's always been turmoil and trouble in the Middle East. And there was back here in 1967. And in 1967, what was going on here was, of course, Israel had been in existence now for 20 years. And the nations around Israel, the Arab nations, still hated Israel for the fact that they'd been given that land. And after 20 years, they'd got together and they'd started to organise this pact of nations against Israel. And it was called the United Arab Republic. And it was headed in Egypt, and it included Jordan and Syria and many other nations. And they had started to join their forces together. And increasingly, the rhetoric that was coming out of those nations, particularly out of Egypt, was that they did not want Israel to be in existence anymore. That they were not happy about what had happened in 1948, and they wanted to destroy Israel from off the face of the earth. And there was the very real prospect at this time that the nation of Israel faced of absolute extinction as a nation. That was what was going on in 1967. And it was very real, and it was a very real threat for Israel. Now, if we just compare, these are the... when the imminent prospect of war became evident, this was what the situation looked like, the key matchups between the two teams. Israel's only been in a nation 20 years, and we know that they fought for their independence in 1948, and this is 20 years on, and they're still the massive underdog compared to the nations that form around them. And these are the matchup of the nations that we're fighting against. We've got Israel over here. And these are all the nations that had formed a pact against them in this war to destroy them. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq and Lebanon were the 5 nations which were actively involved in military pursuit in this particular war. And all of these rest of these nations gave their assistance and said, if you really need us to get involved, we'll get involved. So there was this huge pact of nations against this little nation of Israel at the time. And although Israel had worked in those 20 years to build up what military they can, they were still massively outnumbered compared to the opposition. Israel had 50,000 troops and 30 combat aircraft and 800 tanks. But that was in comparison to the forces of the Arabs' huge army, which outnumbered them hugely. 307,000 troops plus reserves. They had 950,000 combat aircraft and 2,500 tanks. So on paper, it was like a massive wipeout. There was no way that Israel were going to win this battle against this opposition. As this war heated up in the middle of 1967. And these were some of the characters who were involved in this war. I always find the people involved in these wars, they're just such interesting individuals. We've got, in Egypt, was this guy called Gamal Nasser, and he was like the fiery dictator who started the whole thing. And he fired up the rest of the Arab nations and wanted them to get them involved to take down Israel, okay? And then he also influenced King Hussein of Jordan, who was a little bit reluctant to get involved because he had a little bit of a better relationship with Israel, but he was convinced by Nasser that Israel had to be taken down. And so he signed this pact, this deal, to be involved also. Then on the Israeli side, we had Levi Eshkol, who was the Prime Minister at the time, and he was like your nerdy sort of accountant type, all right? He didn't sort of inspire the passion of the nation, but he was a numbers man, and he knew what he needed to know to get things done. And working with him was Moshe Dayan, all right, who was like the rock star general in Israel, who just everyone in the nation loved, okay? And working alongside him was Yitzhak Rabin, who was really the mastermind behind the victory that actually happened in these 6 days. And these two apparently, didn't get on very well because everyone gave Moshe Dayan the credit, even though Yitzhak Rabin was probably the man that was the mastermind behind it. But I think it was probably Moshe Dayan's eye patch, right, that got him all the credit, because it's just so cool, isn't it? Like, if you're going to have a general, you want him to have an eye patch, right, because it looks seriously cool. I don't even know whether he had an injured eye, but he got the eye patch. It was brilliant branding, and everyone in the nation looked up to him and loved him for it. And he got all the credit, most of the credit for the victory of this war, even though Yitzhak Rabin, he was the mastermind behind it. Interestingly, I read that in 2005, the original eye patch of Moshe Dayan turned up on eBay, okay, and it was sold in 2005 on eBay for $75,000. All right, so that's how much they loved Moshe Dayan. So this is the lineup of people that were involved. Now, in the background of this also, and this is what made the whole war so intriguing as well, was the superpowers of the world. We had Brezhnev, who was the president of the USSR at the time, okay? And he was behind the team of Gamal Nasser and King Hussein. And he was feeding them information and was very much on their side. And on the other side, we had LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson. He was the American president at the time, and he was very much giving information, feeding information to the Israelis about how to win this war. The interesting thing about that, and I'm sure probably most of you know that, is that Lyndon B. Johnson had in his family Christadelphians. His grandfather, and you can go on Wikipedia and look it up, it's really fascinating. His grandfather was a Christadelphian, and his father was a Christadelphian. And on Wikipedia it says that these men actually influenced LBJ and some of his policies and decisions about what happened in Israel. Now, I'd thought about that, but I'd never seen it in the context of 1967. It was so important that that man, Lyndon B. Johnson, have an affinity with the Jewish people and want to be involved in them in this particular moment. It's interesting that the man he replaced, JFK, was not like that. He was actually very much aligned with Nasser in Egypt. But God saw fit in his purpose to bring about a situation where this man was the President of the United States at the time and helped Israel in the 6-day war to bring about what happened here. And you see that right through this entire story. It's amazing. And this is what we're looking at. We're looking at miracles. Now, they're not miracles, brothers and sisters, in the sense of what Jesus did miracles, where it was an amazing miracle in front of people's eyes. But it's a miracle, brothers and sisters, in the sense of God working through providence and through his angels to make sure all the events were set up perfectly so that Jerusalem could be taken again by God's people. And that's what was going on here in 1967. So those are the people that were involved. And as we move towards June of 1967, it really started to heat up in the Middle East, and everyone was thinking it's going to come to war. It's going to come to a head. And there were 3 things which actually tipped it over the edge, because the Israelis were very hesitant about wanting to go to war. They knew the matchup, the difference between their strengths and the Arabs, and they were very hesitant. But there was 3 things, brothers and sisters, that tipped them over the edge. The first one was the USSR's involvement. And this USSR actually fed false information to the Egyptians, which said that the Israelis are building up a massive amount of troops on the border, and if you don't do anything about it, they're going to come and invade you. And that was completely false. But they were always sowing the seeds in the background and causing and stirring trouble. And of course, when Nasser heard that, he mounted his army and brought many of his troops into here. And Israel became extremely wary about what was going to happen. The next thing that happened was that the UN peacekeeping troops, who had been in the Sinai area since the war that had happened about 5 years earlier in the Sinai Peninsula, the UN peacekeeping troops were in that area, and the Egyptians forced them out of there. They said, "You've got to leave." Now, normally, in that kind of situation, the UN would have to catch up with all the boys in New York, right? Catch up in the hotels, have a dinner, and work out exactly whether that was going to be possible or not. But the UN, in this particular case, the troops got immediately out of there. And that's one of the things, brothers and sisters, that Israel has never forgiven the UN for. It was the start of this division in the United Nations against Israel, where you can still see those sentiments in the United Nations today. So the UN troops left, and that was a big warning sign to Israel as to what was going to happen here. And then the final thing was that Nasser, who controlled the Straits of Tiran here, obviously a very important spot for Israel in getting their cargo ships and everything in and out of their place, he completely shut the Gulfs of Tiran. And he restricted Israel's maritime movements. And that was probably the tipping point for the nation of Israel that got them to the point where they realised they needed to go to war. Now, at this point, what did Israel do when they saw these things happen? Well, as I said, there was division amongst them internally. Should they go to war? Shouldn't they go to war? Some of them said, yes, we need to preemptively strike, otherwise we're going to be destroyed. Other people, like Ben Gurion, who was like one of the founding figures of Israel, he said, no, I don't think we should go and fight against them because we're going to be destroyed. So there was internal division about what would happen. Now, during that time, the Americans were working very closely with Israel, and their intelligence actually showed, when you looked down and looked at it on paper, and you looked at the organisation of both of these armies, they predicted that Israel would win if they went into war against Egypt. And they predicted if they went to war with Egypt and they went and attacked them first, that they would win in a war that would last maybe 15 days. But if they let the Egyptians strike them first, that it might be 25 to 30 days that they would be embroiled in war. But they predicted that they would win. But that was certainly, brothers and sisters, not the sentiment of the nation at the time. And the sentiment in the actual nation, the city of Jerusalem and the nation of Israel, was fear. And people did not want to go to war. And they thought that this was going to be the end of the nation of Israel after just 20 years. And people started to prepare themselves for the reality of that. One of the preparations they did was that the major soccer stadium in Tel Aviv, a couple of days before the war started, they moved into the stadium and they prepared the stadium as a giant graveyard, which could fit up to 40,000 bodies. And they were preparing for the worst that might come upon them. And so finally, with this pressure around them, on the 1st of June 1967, the Israeli government formed a unity parliament, which was all of the sides got together and said we need to work together here to find a solution because it looks like we're going to go to war. And under pressure from the rest of his generals, the Prime Minister at the time, Levi Eshkol, finally appointed Moshe Dayan, the eye patch man, to be the chief defence minister because the people of Israel had trust in him. They believed in him. He was a man that could inspire passion amongst the people. And he was appointed to be the defence minister. And then on the 4th of June, after intense discussion over those 3 days, and apparently it was intensive discussion, and the Jews, as much as can have arguments with other people, apparently amongst themselves, that's when they can really get fired up. And apparently those 3 days were intense. But on the 4th of June, one day before the war was started, they decided they've got to go to war. It's the only way we're going to be able to survive. And the only way we're going to be able to survive is if we catch them by surprise. Because if they jump on top of us, who knows what could happen. And so they put in practice what happened over the next 6 days in the 6-day war. And it started very quickly. There's the two men, Levi Eshkol and Moshe Dayan, discussing over those 3 days what they would do. Here is the situation that they faced. That's Israel and the borders of Israel at the time. And they put in place the very next morning, on June the 5th, at 7:40 a.m, a plan which was called Operation Focus. And this Operation Focus, which they put into practice at 7:45 on June the 5th, was something that they had practiced very carefully for the last 8 years. They had meticulously practiced every single process of this operation in preparation for when this might be used. And they decided the night before that this is it. It's going to happen. And what happened was at 7:45, this was the plan, at 7:45, there took off from Israel virtually the entire Air Force. Okay, they had 200 combat aircraft, which they had in their Air Force at that time. They had 300 and something planes, which included all their planes and all their helicopters, and they had 200 combat aircraft, which could be used in this kind of offensive mission. And out of those 200 planes, they used 180 of them in this mission. So they threw everything at this particular operation. And at 7:45, those planes took off in succession on their little missions, and they went down where it says there, where those arrows say, and they flew at 20 metres off the ground, or 20 metres off the water. And they did that, of course, to avoid Egyptian radar. And they flew across the water of the Mediterranean Sea here, and they flew down the Dead Sea, and right down here across the Red Sea, to very specific points which were that they were going to be targeting. And the points that they were going to be targeting was the Air Force of the Egyptians. As I said, 9 years of calculated planning. And they all took off in succession, these planes, to these particular parts. And when they arrived at the air bases, which they had planned to, the planes moved into the air bases and they strafed the runways, which is like machine gunned all the runways, and bombed all the runways to take every single runway out. And then they moved to destroy as many of the Egyptian planes as they could in the first hour or two of that operation. Now, it was amazingly, and this is one of the reasons why they were able to succeed, they had anticipated that when they arrived at these air bases, they would at least have sounded, they were hoping to get there before the warning was sounded, but when they got there, they thought the warning would be sounded and that the anti-aircraft guns would be straight away on them and trying to destroy them. But what had happened that very morning was Nasser himself had been travelling across the Sinai here to go and visit one of the army bases, and all anti-aircraft weaponry had been told that it wasn't to be used that morning. And so the Israelis were able to come right into the air bases, and they were able to, in that 2 hours' time, virtually destroy the entire Egyptian air base. Of the 350 combat aircraft that the Egyptians had in those air bases, they destroyed 338 of them in that 2 hour period. In just 2 hours, they destroyed that. Unbelievable what they managed to do. Here's the planes that they had, and they weren't the most state-of-the-art planes. They were sort of like borrowed and begged and stealed from every other country they could, particularly the French, to get this military to do what they needed to do. And the precision in which they were able to enact it was unbelievable. Yitzhak Rabin, who was obviously the chief guy who was looking over the mastermind of this is what he said later. He said, "Our airmen struck the enemy's planes so accurately that no one in the world understands how it was done. And people seek technological explanations or secret weapons that we may have had to achieve it." That's what he said about the operation, because people were so amazed. And the Egyptians said, well, the US must have been involved, or some other power must have been involved in order for them to be able to achieve what they achieved in those short hours. So, after 2 hours, this amazing feat has been enacted, and virtually the whole air force of the Egyptians had been destroyed. The next thing that they did was they wasted no time. As soon as they had success from these air bases, they took off to Amman and they took off to Syria, and they did the same thing with the air forces of Syria and the air forces of Jordan, and they destroyed equally the vast majority of the air forces of those two places. So all of a sudden, in 2 hours' time, before 10 a.m. in the morning, they had destroyed the key air forces of their opposition, and they now had command of the skies. Now, the Egyptians were completely caught off guard by this, obviously, and were in a complete panic. But apparently such was the power of Nasser, who was like the president of the Egyptians, that none of like the other Egyptians who were down the scale from him would ever like to say something bad to him, because it would not be good for them. All right? So they didn't have the confidence to tell this man what had actually happened. And when they did, and when someone did, of course, Nasser was not going to admit to the world what had happened in those just 2 short hours. So blaring out on Egyptian radio and Egyptian media and Egyptian newspapers was that the Israelis had tried to attack them, but they had been unbelievably successful in destroying them. They said that in the first hour, 70 planes of the Israelis had been destroyed, and not one Egyptian had come to a casualty, and not one plane had been destroyed. And that was what was in the newspapers, and that was what was on the radios that got sent out to the people. So the people were like, this is awesome, this is great, we're winning this great victory. And that got sent out to all the people. Meanwhile, while he was saying that, already the Israelis under Ariel Sharon, this is what Ariel Sharon looked like back then, he's looking slim, okay? He obviously got stuck into some falafels over the next 20 or 30 years. But he was looking slim here, and during this period, and this is on the same day, after they had superiority in the air, they didn't have anything to be afraid of anymore, and they streamed into the Sinai Peninsula and headed straight to the Suez Canal. And very quickly he made gains in that particular area. They took the area of Gaza as well, this particular zone here. They moved in and got superiority before the Egyptians even knew what had hit them. And what was the reaction from the world? Well, this was not like just page 5 world news. This was like major world news. This was like the news which was going on in the world. And of course, people didn't have the media that they do have today, like phones and all these kind of things, to be in touch with what's happening. They had the TV at night on the news, and they had newspapers. And people were glued to find out what was going to happen. This is a newspaper, a Melbourne newspaper, The Sun, from the time. And the whole entire front page is dedicated to the Six-Day War at the time. Dad had a newspaper from 1948, and I think it still had something about the football, but there was no football whatsoever on The Sun in June in Melbourne. That is extremely rare. It was full of the Six-Day War, and the whole world was fascinated about what was going on in the Middle East and what was going to happen and whether it was going to escalate into a bigger war, because the war in Vietnam was already going on, and were the USSR and were America going to be embroiled in an even bigger, huger war going on at the time. Now, interestingly, and I didn't know this, but the sentiment at the time across the world was very pro-Israel. That's completely different today, isn't it? Apparently, and this is a photo, and there's many other photos that I could have put up. This is a protest that happened at the time in front of the White House. And there was other protests that happened in France and Paris and Europe and Italy. And all of it was people getting out on the streets to defend Israel. We support Israel. Now, you never see that today. But during this time, there was still this sentiment towards Israel and them being the underdog. And they were there, the world was there to support them. And of course, there was, the reaction as well between the US and the US was tension. And apparently the little red phone between the US and the USSR was being hotly used by Lyndon Johnson and the president of the USSR to try and figure out what was going on here. And the UN also met that very day to discuss what they were going to do and whether they were going to decide that there should be a ceasefire which was put out, that everyone should obey this ceasefire. And interestingly, it was the Russians that said, no, we don't want a ceasefire. And the reason why they didn't want a ceasefire is because the only intelligence they had to this point on what was going on was the newspapers and the radio from the Egyptians, Nasser, who had said everything was going awesome. So they said, actually, no, we don't want a ceasefire, because they're like, he's nearly done it, he's nearly won the war. Well, let's just hold it off for another couple of days and the Israelis will be destroyed. And they listened to the news reports of the Egyptians. And as a result, the UN ceasefire wasn't called for another couple of days. That's how the world reacted to what was going on. Then, once Israel had control of the Sinai Peninsula and basically taken care of Egypt, they then moved their focus to Jordan. And of course, this is where the border of Jordan went in 1967. It went very close to the city of Jerusalem and round there. And the Jordanians had this huge area of land here. And the Israelis, the Prime Minister at the time, he sent a message to the Prime Minister of Israel. The Prime Minister of Israel sent a message to the King Hussein after this had happened. He said, don't attack us. We've got nothing against you. We don't want you to enter this war. We're not interested in going into attack against you. It's between us and Egypt. Please don't get involved. But Hussein, from pressure from the Egyptians, who lied and said, we're actually winning this war, you just get on board with us and we'll have the whole of Israel for ourselves. Reluctantly, he listened to them. And at 10 a.m. on June the 5th, so it's the same morning that the Israelis have gone down and attacked here, on 10 a.m. in that morning, he ordered his troops and he ordered his army to move in and start fighting against Israel. Now that was bad news for Israel, because across here, I think at the smallest particular spot from the border to the sea is only 9 miles. And that makes Israel extremely vulnerable. So they had no choice but to fight hard against the Jordanians in response to that attack. And they moved, of course, as they attacked, they moved towards Jerusalem very quickly. And Israel had never planned to take Jerusalem on this particular occasion. And it was actually only floated the next day as the Israeli war cabinet got together and they just were trying to decide what to do. It was only floated on that next day that perhaps we should go and take Jerusalem. Perhaps we should go in there and take Jerusalem now while we've got the opportunity. And that was dismissed initially by the Jews, particularly Moshe Dayan, the eye patch man. He was like, I don't think we should do it. And he was particularly worried about the backlash that they'd get from the world, particularly the Christian nations and the rest of the world who obviously cared very much for the holy site of Jerusalem. And so initially he said, no, I don't want to get involved. But the troops kept pushing towards Jerusalem and they were right on the edge of the city of Jerusalem. And when they were right on the edge of the city of Jerusalem, and this is the next day on June the 6th, Moshe Dayan received information that what was going to happen was the UN, the next few hours, or even maybe even into the next day, was going to call for a ceasefire. And he was like, okay, so I've got just a few hours, and I'm right here, and I'm standing on the Mount of Olives, and I can see Jerusalem, like the greatest city in the world, and I've got all my troops here, and I know I can beat them. And he took the decision, without even going to the Israeli cabinet, he took the decision that, no, we're just going to go and get it. Because as soon as the ceasefire happens, and if we don't have that city, it's going to be an absolute mess. I want to take it now. And so he moved in a swift amount of time, in just that couple of hour window, he moved into Jerusalem. He took his troops into Jerusalem, and he said when he went in there to fight, it was one of the hardest battles he's ever fought because they were being so careful. Apparently both sides were being so careful because they didn't want to damage the city because it's so sacred to them. So they were really careful with their machine gun fire, making sure they didn't shoot any of the sacred buildings as they moved into that site. And the Jordanians apparently were tenacious in their defence of that city. They knew that they were outnumbered. They knew that they were going to be destroyed, that the Israelis were more powerful in that particular situation. But apparently they fought to the death. And even when the army called for a retreat, there were some of the Jordanian soldiers who said, I don't care if I die, I want to die defending this city. So much passion there was to hold on to that city of Jerusalem. But finally the damn wall broke. And the Israelis streamed into that old city. And many of these troops had never even been in that city before, because from 1948 the Jordanians barred any of the Israelis from going into Jerusalem. And they moved into that city, and many of them didn't even know where the Western Wall was, but they moved through all the tiny streets of the old city of Jerusalem, and eventually, brothers and sisters, they arrived at the most sacred place for the Jews, which was, of course, the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall, the final remaining pieces of the temple that was around at the time of Jesus. And when they arrived there, this photo was taken. These are some of the first troops that got there. And this is a very famous photograph taken by David Rubringer, who was working for one of the newspapers, who had got into he had sort of preempted what was going to happen, and he made his way right into the city because he knew that this was going to be an historic moment. And he took this photo, which is probably the photo from the 1967 war. And these are a group of young soldiers who got to the Western Wall first. And it's interesting to read his description about what happened at that particular moment. He said there was just this outpouring of emotion of these people, anyone who was there. All of the soldiers, he being a photographer, he said, I'm not a religious man at all. And most of the soldiers, brothers and sisters, were not religious. The Jewish people, when they came and re-established the nation of Israel in 1948, most of the people that did that were secular people who'd turned their backs on God and weren't interested in God. But it's interesting that when they got into Jerusalem, that city, and when they got to that wall, that there was this outpouring of emotion about that place. And David Rubringer says, even though he wasn't a religious man, that he felt this religious feeling about that time. And so did many of the other troops and soldiers who were there at that particular point. Interesting, isn't it? I think that you don't have to scratch the surface too much in the Israeli person to find God. And we know, brothers and sisters, that that's what's going to happen, don't we? And we know that the attitude of the Israelis today is often atheistic. And they don't believe that God is the God of the world who's in charge of them and in charge of their destiny. But if you scratch the surface a little bit, like they did in this particular time, in their hearts is God, the God of Israel. And God is going to bring that out in his nation. That's what he's doing. That's what all these events are doing, brothers and sisters. They're bringing about and changing the heart of that people who is his people because he wants to save them. So they took Jerusalem, and they didn't just leave it there. They went on from that point. This is actually a famous photo of the two generals walking into that city. You've got Moshe Dayan here, and you've got Yitzhak Rabin. Moshe's looking happy. Yitzhak is spewing he doesn't have an eye patch, okay, particularly for that photo. But those two men walked into the city and triumphantly took that city. But they didn't leave it there. They then went on and ended up taking the rest of the hills and mountains of Israel, okay? The area of Samaria, the West Bank. They moved into all that area and took that section. Then, on June the 8th to 9th, so the last couple of days of the Six-Day War, and the Syrians, after the Jordanians had been dealt with, the Syrians then attacked Israel. Israel again were reluctant to be involved and attack the Syrians back. But eventually they decided to move into this area of the Golan Heights. And you've probably heard of that because it's always something that's brought up, the Golan Heights, even today. And it's a very strategic location in the nation of Israel because there's mountains up there and you've got a brilliant strategic military point. And so they moved into the Golan Heights and they took that section also. And then finally, after they'd taken that section, there was finally a ceasefire called on the 11th of June, and after 6 days, the Israelis had taken a huge amount of land and won this amazing battle in just 6 days. Now, the victory itself had a powerful impact upon the nation after that happened. They named it the Six-Day War. And I never knew why they named it the Six-Day War. I thought they named it the Six-Day War because it went for 6 days. But apparently the reason, and Moshe Dayan named it the 6 days, is because he likened it to the 6 days of creation. And he saw this episode, what happened to them and taking Jerusalem, as the final rebirth of this particular nation. And there was a massive national outpouring of emotion. This is some of the soldiers who, after they'd won this amazing victory. And apparently the song that was written at the time, which was number one on the charts, was that song Jerusalem of Gold. That went to the top of the charts at the particular time because it so much summed up the sentiments, the nationalistic feeling of the nations. And as I said, although most of the nation was secular, they felt this religious feeling about what had happened. The other thing that happened was that this victory sparked an enormous immigration to Israel from other places. We know that after World War II and even 1948, there was this massive influx of people which came to Israel. And after 1967, the same thing happened. And Jewish people from all around the world wanted to come and they wanted to meet and be a part of this new nation of Israel. Now, this is a summary of what happened in the war. So, this is the section that they had pre-1967, before the war. And in just 6 days, this is what they took. It's amazing. Absolutely incredible. Now, it's interesting the places they took. They're the places that have caused Israel all the trouble since. they took the Sinai Peninsula, and that was the one that they actually gave back about 5 or 6 years later in the mid-70s. They gave the large proportion of the Sinai Peninsula back. But they kept the Gaza Strip until 2005, right, which has caused huge contention. They've kept most of the West Bank. Some of this has gone back to the Palestinians, but to like an absolute political minefield in there as to who owns what and what city goes to where. And it all happened out of what happened in 1967. And they also took the Golan Heights, and they keep that Golan Heights as of today. So the whole map of Israel was completely changed in just 6 days. It was a miracle what had happened. Now, all of this was happening, of course, in accordance with Bible prophecy about what God had said would happen. Now, sometimes when we look at Bible prophecy, we only realise, like, way in hindsight what has actually happened and how it's unfolded. But the amazing thing about what happened in that 6-day war, and what made it so incredible, I suppose, was that it was like Bible prophecy that was being, like, happening and right before people's eyes in a very quick amount of time. I think that's what made it so incredible for the people who were living at that particular point. So let's just look at 5 things that got fulfilled, that happened as a result of what happened in the 6-day war. The first one, of course, was Jerusalem's back in Jewish hands. Just as Jesus said. He said, it's going to be trodden down for years by the Gentiles, but one day, in fact almost 2,000 years later, the Jews again would take that city. And Jesus said that in Luke 21 and verse 24. Israel takes the mountains. So up until that point, the higher plains of Israel, which were the Golan Heights and the hills and mountains of Samaria, they didn't own. But we know from Ezekiel chapter 38, when the Northern Confederacy will come down into the nation of Israel and overtake them, that they will come on the mountains of Israel. And so Israel took that section of the land which was essential before the Northern Confederacy could return, in Ezekiel chapter 38. The other thing that happened as a result of this particular event is they started to develop this spirit, which is talked about in Ezekiel chapter 38, which was when Israel will finally be invaded, when the Northern Confederacy comes down to invade Israel, they will dwell securely or confidently in the land. Now, up until that point, they didn't feel that way. For the 20 years after 1948 to 1967, there was no confidence in the nation of Israel. Not by their leaders, and certainly not by their people. But after the events of 1967, grew this sort of arrogant strength that the Israelis have now got. That you see when Benjamin Netanyahu does a speech at the UN or any other speech that he does. There's this confidence in their own ability and their own strategy. And I suppose it's not surprising, is it? When you see some of the things that they've done militarily against the odds. Who is going to destroy them? Who is going to take them down? And God said that's the spirit that you're going to see at the time of the end. You're going to see a spirit in the Israeli nation which is self-confident and self-powerful and doesn't need me and doesn't need anyone else. Or if it needs anyone else, it'll make an alliance to shore up its own security. That's what God said the spirit of Israel would be like. And after 1967, that's what started to grow in this nation. That's what started to build in this nation. They dwelt securely and they dwelt confidently. Number 4, Jerusalem becomes a burdensome stone. The NET version of Zechariah chapter 12 says this, I will make Jerusalem a heavy burden. All who try to carry it will be seriously injured. And that's what Israel took on in 1967. They took on that burdensome stone of Jerusalem. And it's a heavy stone to bear. And why is it such a heavy stone to bear? Because everyone wants their hands on it. Everyone wants a piece of Jerusalem. It's so important to the Muslims, isn't it? It's like the second most important city. And there's millions and millions of Muslims who love Jerusalem and would love to get their hands on possessing that city. And of course the Christians, the Catholics, the wider Christian community sees that city as an international city. And they've vied to try and make it that, to take it out of the hands of the Israelis and make it an international city which is owned by everyone. And of course the Jewish people, now that the Jewish people have got a taste for it, and they've actually got it in their hands, there's no way they want to give it up. And that's why they keep building more and more little settlements on it, and more apartments, and like putting more and more furniture on there, so that they secure it for their own. But God said, you'll never secure it. It'll never be at peace until I come. And Jerusalem will be a burdensome stone to anyone who tries to touch it. And that's happened since 1967. It has become like that. And then finally, number 5 was a distaste for Israel grows throughout Europe and all nations. Zechariah 14, which is our reading, which we read tonight, said that ultimately what's going to happen, and we all know what's going to happen, is that all nations, it says in Zechariah chapter 14, are going to come against Jerusalem to fight. All nations are going to come and want to destroy Jerusalem. And there began in 1967 this distaste for the nation of Israel. As I said before then, Israel was viewed very much as the underdog, as the nation which people could get behind. But after 1967, people started to turn their back on Israel. France, very quickly after the 1967 war, who were a very close ally to Israel and helped them a lot in their first 20 years, they turned their back on them, along with a lot of other European nations. And now we see that distaste in not just the powerful nations of the world, not just in the United Nations, but we see it in even the general public. You would never see a protest on the streets for the nation of Israel anymore. In fact, you would see the opposite, because there is a distaste for that nation. And God says that's what's going to happen. Because all nations eventually are going to make a confederacy against that particular city. So 5 things, brothers and sisters, which happened as a result of that war, and most of them very quickly when it was viewed over those days. Now, as well as having a powerful impact on the nation of Israel itself, this particular event had a powerful impact on our brotherhood and our community. It was interesting when I was thinking about this talk. I actually wrote an email to as many brothers and sisters in Melbourne as I could who had lived at that time and could remember that time in their ecclesias and what that event had done for them. And it was amazing to read all those letters, because people were like, they just fired straight back with their emails about this, because it was something, brothers and sisters, that meant so much to so many people. Apparently, and this is just going from a couple of things that some of the people wrote back and emailed back to me, ecclesial halls, particularly over that 2 or 3 week period during that 6-day war, were absolutely jam-packed with people. And it wasn't just Christadelphians, it was ex-Christadelphians, people who hadn't been seen sometimes for 20 years, rolled back into ecclesial halls because they saw the significance of this event. And when you think about the event, it's an amazingly significant event. And there were baptisms, many baptisms in ecclesias. 2 from our own ecclesia that I know of as a result of that. Brother Charlie Taylor, who's probably known to many of you here, was baptised the very night before the 6-day war. And he said that he believed that he'd got the golden ticket to the kingdom. Because it was like, this is it, I've been baptised in the night and Jesus is going to come tomorrow. I'm the one. You know, I've got that golden ticket. Annette Pudney, my auntie, who's also probably known to many of you here, she was baptised just 2 weeks after that event, and that had a powerful effect upon her. And it had a powerful effect, brothers and sisters, on many brothers and sisters at the time when it was happening. And many people were baptised. And apparently lectures like that people would put on in this particular 2 or 3 week period were just inundated with people. There was one lecture, and I think most cities had like big lectures in their town halls or whatever for this particular occasion. Melbourne had one, and we had it in the Athenaeum Theatre, which is a major theatre in the Collins Street of Melbourne. And there was 250 people, visitors, that came to that particular event. And apparently they had to send some of the Christadelphians home who had come to that particular lecture. I mean, how long since that's happened? Apparently one brother and sister said they were walking towards the hall, and there was like a big crowd of people walking, with them, and they thought, wouldn't this be amazing if all these people were going to our lecture? And they were. And they all went to their lecture and filled that particular hall. I mean, the opposite happens today, doesn't it? I remember when we had a seminar series last year and we were walking to the little TAFE where it was happening, and there were some people walking with us, and we're thinking, this is great. We're going to get some of these people. They're all coming along. And then right at the end, right at the last door, it was like we went into the Christadelphians and they went into the pottery class. Right? And there was no one that came. But back here, there was, even in the general public, there was a spirit. There was a spirit of that something big was happening in the world, and people wanted to know about it, and people wanted to hear about it. And many Christadelphians believed, and it wasn't even just Christadelphians, there was even other Christian groups who believed that this was the moment that Jesus Christ was going to return. Many people believed that their life would be cut short now, that they wouldn't get married, that they wouldn't have children. But the Lord would be in the earth right then and right there. And he was going to come and set up his kingdom. But it didn't happen, didn't it, brothers and sisters? And weeks went past. And months went past. And then years went past. And then when decades went past. And this year, brothers and sisters, it's 50 years since that's happened. And the Lord is still not in the earth. He's still not here. And I found this interesting little passage which I'll read to you, which was an excerpt from a talk which was done by Brother H.P. Mansfield the week after these events. And I thought it was very apt because it summarises very well, I think, what we should take out of what happened in that particular time and what it means for us. He said this, and it was apparently in a Bible school, a week or so after the 6-Day War. He said, "We've been lifted up by the events that have taken place in recent weeks. There has been an excitement about it, as we have seen Israel march on to victory, and as far as the world is concerned, to glory. But we must recognise this fact, that the Scriptures imply that these things are going to recede. The indication we have from Scripture is that the Lord Jesus Christ will return not when the brotherhood is lifted up with excitement at the possibilities of his return, but when they are taken off guard. And so the Lord said in one place, 'In an hour when you think not, that's when the Son of Man will come.' And again, as it was in the days of Noah and as it was in the days of Lot, that will be the time when the Son of Man comes." And our Lord issued a parable in which he declared to the servants by saying, "My Lord delays his coming." Now this is all the indications of Scripture, that the Lord Jesus Christ will return at a time when people are not looking for him. And we need to bear that in mind. And we need to be determined that the things we have seen in recent weeks will never, ever be allowed to recede from our mind. But we will always capture that thrill, that excitement that was ours as we listen to the fact that Russia and the Western world and Israel and the Arab nations were involved in a crisis in the Middle East. We must not allow that to fade from our minds. I thought that was a really powerful and interesting comment that he made in that talk. And that, brothers and sisters, I guess, is our challenge, isn't it? And that's why we have looked, I suppose, at these events which have happened to the nation of Israel, because we want to try and remember and never forget that just 50 years ago, in the history of the world, 50 years is nothing. Just 50 years ago, brothers and sisters, God worked a miracle in the nation of Israel. And he had all the players there that will be there in Armageddon. There was Russia and the Middle East and Israel, and there was war in that place. And if God could bring about in such a quick and swift way what happened in those 6 days, then surely, brothers and sisters, he's faithful to do as he said he would when he returns with his Son. That's what those words are saying to us. And I think the other thing about those words that's powerful isn't exactly what he said coming to pass now in our world. He said there that it wasn't going to be in a time of fervour and anticipation when the Lord would return, but rather it would be a time that was like the days of Noah, a time that was like the days of Lot. And brothers and sisters, isn't that what our world is like right now? Isn't what's going on in our world, and even our communities, brothers and sisters, and our societies, and our suburbs, like they're turning away from our God, aren't they? Just in my lifetime, I'm 39 years old, but just even the last 20 years, brothers and sisters, there's been a discarding of God and his ways and his principles, and a turning against those things. And that's what God said it would be like. He said it would be like the times of Noah. And he said it would be the times of Lot, when people would turn their back on God and not want him in their lives. That would be the time when we're to look and to be ready and to be watching for his return. And so that's what we hope to have gained from our nights about Israel, to capture some of the fervour and the spirit that was happening in enthusiasm that was happening then, and also to try and stay alert ourselves for all the things that we know are happening in our world. Thank you.